Hey everyone, it's Evan Kirstel. I'm absolutely excited to have the one and only Geoffrey Moore, author, speaker, high-tech business advisor, author of many books, but of course his seminal book, Crossing the Chasm. Geoffrey, how are you?
Well, I'm fine. Thank you very much. I turned up to be in Silicon Valley today. Where are you, by the way?
I am happen to be in Florida, the part of the state that hasn't been devastated, but normally out of Boston. But thank you so much for joining us. In preparation for this interview, I looked over so many of your prior interviews going back on YouTube. Gosh, 15 plus years, and you look great, by the way.
Well, thank
So,
you.
yeah, 15 years just flies by like that. But tell us, what have you been up to through the pandemic? Some say it's over. What have you been thinking about? What's been top of mind in this challenging period?
Well, it was interesting because I'm, as you point out, in addition to, well, two things. I'm a speaker and an advisor. So obviously during the pandemic, the speaking business faded off. We tried to do virtual speeches. They're kind of okay. They're not great.
Right.
Ironically or interestingly, the advising business actually got much better during the pandemic because we all went virtual. And actually, if you want to do advisory work, you're normally working with one or two or maybe a small group of people. It's actually better on Zoom often than it is in person. And that advisory work all centered around a book called Zone to Win, which is the latest business book. And that's a book which just says, hey, how do you cross the chasm if you're a big established enterprise? I mean, if you're a startup, read Crossing the Chasm. But the problem with the big established enterprise is you got a lot of businesses to run and you have this startup opportunity, but how do you fund them? How do you manage them? And it turns out there's a lot of internal conflicts that are just built into that situation. So Zone to Win was a book just saying, okay, how can you organize to mitigate those conflicts? And then what are the best practices within each of the various zones? And that's been fascinating. I've been doing that. That's probably been 5 years worth of work, and it's an ongoing work. The book was written with Salesforce and Microsoft, so it was Mark Benioff's team and Satya Nadella's team.
Wow.
So really, really great place to start. And but subsequently, a lot of other companies are adopting it because any company that basically is a going concern and is funding itself out of its own working, capital, out of its own operating income, has the problem of how they're not a venture capitalist. So how do I take venture risk inside a system that's not designed for venture risk? So it's been a very interesting ride.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I want to dive into a lot of those themes in detail, but first, let me take a little trip back because I was just watching a moment ago in preparation a YouTube video you made 15 years ago talking about, of course, disruptive innovation and YouTube and Facebook and all the companies that we know so well, including Yahoo. We don't really know so well anymore. Um, and flash forward, we find big tech is bigger than ever. And your views back 50 years ago were so prescient. I want to get some perspective on where we go from here. When you talk about big tech, including the Microsofts and Facebooks and Amazons of the world, are they essentially invincible? Have they built castles that are so big, the moats are so big that these are the companies that we're going to have throughout the rest of our adult lives?
Well, I think what happens with companies is there is an S curve where they rise to power, and then once they get kind of instantiated in the architecture, there is a kind of a semi-permanence, like an SAP or an Oracle or a Cisco or an Intel or whatever. Even if they aren't top of mind necessarily with everybody every year, they've just become part of our infrastructure, and so sure, that makes sense. I think the biggest change came at the turn of the century, where all of a sudden consumer computing came out of nowhere.
Right.
Between cloud and mobile in that first decade, it completely revolutionized social life, personal life, dating life, whatever, political life as we're now recognizing. But that whole ecosystem was designed outboard of the enterprise B2B architectures. So all the architecture that we used in the 90s, none of that was used to build the consumer digital system, which is why it was so surprising. What's been interesting about this decade, and I think as we're looking to the next decade, is we said, well, look, we want the consumer experience, but we need the enterprise infrastructure. So we need to put the two together. And so we talked about something called systems of engagement, which were like enterprise systems on the bottom, but consumer systems on the top. Well, it turns out those two architectures are so different that we created a massive amount of security problems and just a huge amount of complexity for everybody to run. So what happened in the last 10 years is we're going to this as a service world, is more and more of that complexity is now being authentically dealt with. So we're seeing communication programs as a service. We're seeing everything as a service. And that, I think, is going to have a big impact on re-engineering government, education, medicine, a lot of things that we've struggled with my whole adult life. Trying to make them affordable and efficient at scale. I think we have a real opportunity to do that. And so I'm very excited about that, looking to the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'm super excited and optimistic as well, although there are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic right now, particularly given the R word, the recession word, the crash in the markets, the crypto winter. Where's your thinking? Optimistic, pessimistic, glass half full, glass half empty? I'd love your perspective on that for the founders and startup entrepreneurs out there.
Well, so first of all, one of the interesting things about recessions is that they actually in some ways benefit a startup. So particularly like right now for two reasons. One, first of all, there's still capital on the sidelines. So it's not that there's no capital to invest in startups. Second of all, in this decade, I mean, compare it back to the 90s and the 80s, it's much cheaper to create a startup than it ever has been in the past because it's a digital business. You don't have to have a data center. You don't have to have your $2 million or $3 million put into just getting started. So that's really cool. The other thing that's the advantage of a startup is a startup has one and only one mission. So if you give another dollar to that startup, it only has one place to spend it. And that means it's focused and it's typically got a point product that's increasing, very differentiated, not yet at scale. And frankly, it may not work perfectly yet, but it's on the way. Now, a large corporation, by contrast, is very hindered by a recession because they've got this ongoing legacy business. They've got workforce, they've got customer relationships, they have inventory, they have whatever the heck it is. They've got to try to figure a soft landing. And that is very hard to manage that and at the same time catch the next wave. So I think this is a good, but if you're a startup, it's really important to be frugal. This whole notion of the rule of 40 was great when we had tailwinds. We don't have tailwinds and we're not going to have them for a while. So you've got to be very frugal with your dollar. You can't lose a lot of money just and say, well, I'll make it up with growth. But it's a great opportunity to tackle, and particularly a B2B startup where you tackle a really tough problem, you get very focused on it. People go, wow, I need help with that. So I am willing to work with you.
That's fascinating insight. You've seen so many startups succeed, fail. You've really seen it all in the B2B software landscape in particular. If you were to start a company today, what niche or vertical or industry would you focus on? Just blue sky thinking here.
Well, I think initially we have this sort of 4-stage model of technology adoption, and so that first stage we called the early market. And the early market, you really do organize around the technology itself, and you don't have a market focus yet. You have a technology focus, and you're looking for individual visionary customers who believe what you believe. You see something in this technology. This is going to be telemedicine. This is going to be, mRNA vaccine development, whatever the heck it is. And there's a few customers that will say, "Whoa, that's exciting! Quantum computing? Yeah, I want to work with this." Most customers are going to go, "No, thank you." But anyway, so I would say the first thing you'd say is find a disruptive technology which has this sort of Andy Grove used to call it the 10x advantage. On one vector of innovation, it just outperforms anything that's around. That alone, you can do projects with it basically, and you can get customers, but they're one-offs. They're very bespoke. It's a very handcrafted business. Then that second thing, the crossing the chasm phase, is when you find your first use case for your first target segment that's repeatable, and it's got to be a use case that's big enough to matter. So it's got to be a market that you can grow in, but you're small. So it's $50 to $100 million is plenty big for you. By the way, it's way too small for a large corporation. So the good news is, again, this is why it's easier to be a startup, because a $10 to $50 million opportunity for you is like, whoa, I love this. And so you do that. And it's got to be a use case that's really urgent and very compelling, meaning like, I can't live with this problem much longer. So because you're this nobody and you need the customer to bring you in. And then you need to commit to solve that problem completely, working with partners if necessary. But you're not going to leave that customer until the problem's done. Because if you get that same use case the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth time in that same segment, you get a reputation of, well, these are the guys. It's either Pfizer or Moderna, right? It's not Johnson & Johnson, is it? No. Okay. In other words, you find out who it is, and then that segment organizes around you, and it's like winning the New Hampshire primary. You've won like 4 delegates or whatever the hell that number of delegates they have. But you're going to go to the convention because you're now a real deal. So that crossing the chasm is that real deal thing. And so right now, I mean, what I would be focusing on, I mean, virtually, I mean, I think it depends a lot on your technology. As I said, I started out as a teacher in education. I've always sort of been a kind of educator. So I really care a ton about education. I care about health. At my demographic, I sort of care about healthcare. So those are some of the places where I hope that we'll be able to use the technology going forward.
Brilliant. Well, I hope so as well. When you look at Crossing the Chasm, and it's sold millions of copies, the seminal work in so many business schools and with business leaders, how do you reflect back on it? What would you add to your thinking at the time? Extend, change, modify?
It's funny,
edit?
That book came out in 1990, and I've had to revise it twice. Now, the reason I had to revise it twice was because nobody could remember the examples. I mean, the turnover in tech was so high that you go, well, who are these companies? So I did it once in 1999. I did it once in 2014, and so the 2014 one is still the current one. But what's happened is, in both cases, I had a chance to say, okay, now what do you want to change? And the framework has really held up very, very well. And by the way, it's not my framework. I mean, it started with a guy named Everett Rogers with a technology adoption lifecycle. And then the guy I worked for, Regis McKenna, kind of applied it all to the technology world. So
you're being very humble. Yeah, very nice.
But it's held up very, very well. But the examples, like, for example, the SaaS world, the way you cross the chasm in SaaS is this land and expand motion. We never did land and expand in the 80s or 90s. That was not the game. The game was, land with a big thump. Tell the biggest deal you can. Well, you worked at Oracle at one point. And then, frankly, as soon as you've sold the biggest deal you can, leave town. It was a different world.
No, I love in particular your strategy and consulting work, but also just your sales and marketing color commentary. It's just so wonderful to read. What's the buyer's journey like these days in the enterprise from your perspective? How have buyers changed? How are they changing? It's pretty different than it was even a few short years ago.
It is, and I think a little bit like we have the experience as a consumer, a parallel experience with buying a car. In the 80s and 90s, the car dealer had the information advantage, and you were like putty in their hands. Okay, today you have the information advantage over the car dealer. And I think in general, in B2B worlds, power has shifted from the vendor to the customer, and particularly with the software as a service model or anything as a service model. For the first time now, the customer can either, at the most active, they could unsubscribe, but what they more likely will do is churn or attrit or go sideways. But any one of those things is highly destructive to your business model. So for the first time, a vendor saying, look, I have to have a customer success department as opposed to a customer support department. So in the old days, if my product works, getting value out of it is your problem, not my problem. My product worked. But today, if you don't get value out of my service, you're gonna attrit, and that's gonna kill my business model. So therefore, that whole thing of the business having more power is important. What that means is we have this thing called customer journeys. By the way, all the marketing software in the world, every one of them has a customer journey module. But I wrote a blog about this recently. Those aren't customer journeys. Those are vendor journeys. Our customer journey is, well, did they get qualified as a sales lead? Did they get our proposal? It's like, that wasn't about the customer. That was about us. The customer journey starts with, what value, what is the problem, either the problem or the opportunity that they're trying to capitalize on or solve? And then how would they know that they did that? And then how does our product intervene? And how do we have to change their behavior? And what change management will be required in order to create that new behavior? And if we don't own that whole journey back from the customer's motive, then we're going to get marginalized. And so customer success is now, it started off as just getting people to adopt the product, but now it's getting to like, no, we need to have a dialogue all the way to the budget owning economic buyers saying, why in the world are you even spending money in this category? And then what are you expecting? And then how are you organized to get it? So how do we organize to post up with your organization? I mean, it's working backward from the customer as opposed to forward from our engineering, which, in the course, we started this career back in the day because we both have some of the gray hair that people might notice. It was engineering driven. It was a completely engineering driven. And I think that, and by the way, it still depends on engineering. The magic is still in the engineering, but the marketing, I think, has really, instead of being marketing from the product out, as we used to say, put a little lipstick on the pig if you have to, going that way. Now it's coming the other way in, going, what is the customer vision and intent, and how do we post up to it?
Absolutely. I think the sales engagement model has completely changed. I carried a bag as a salesperson for almost 2 decades, and lots of schmoozing and golfing and in-person events. I mean, how much of that is really even relevant anymore in the sales game, the revenue game, or is it?
Right, because we were wooing. It was a little bit like, don't confuse the demo with the install, right? I mean, there was a kind of a coffee is for closers. I mean, it was a totally egocentric, self-centric game. And
Right.
and I think, by the way, because product was king, and product was king. And by the way, we changed the world in the 80s and the 90s with client server computing and the internet, bringing China into the global economy, bringing India into the I mean, we did a lot of good stuff with that model, but it was a very self-serving operating model. Now we're in a situation where we have to have a customer-serving operating model. So it's more important to be able to stay in relationship with the customer. Farmers are more important than hunters. You still need new logos, by the way. I mean, it really is the same game. It's just being played with a different dynamic.
Yeah, and the role of content, as we're sort of creating now, has never been more important. Content is king, sort of distribution is King Kong. So things like this live stream become really interesting in B2B. So do you still dabble in investing? You wear the venture capital hat as well these days?
Great. So I've never actually been an investor, but I've been a venture partner with More David Al Ventures back in 1998, and then a firm spun out of that called Wildcat Technology Ventures, where I'm a venture partner there. My role in the venture world has always been to be the crossing the chasm guy. So basically, it's always been the B2B side of, because crossing the chasm and consumer it doesn't work the way it has a different dynamic. But B2B crossing the chasm, as we point out, is held up very well. So that's what I still do that, and so. The fund that's currently being raised right now is going to focus on climate change, and it's going to focus on digital health. So again, 2 things I care a ton about, and how can we take technology and apply it to those class of problems?
Do you have another book in the works? Anything percolating there? What might we expect in terms of themes or topics?
There's a book I wrote, which is called the Infinite Staircase, but it's a philosophy. Basically, what I did is I thought, well, I'm a frameworks kind of guy. I like to explain complicated things with frameworks. How about the universe? How would that work? So it was like, because I just wanted to write it down. So anyway, it's called the Infinite Staircase, and it basically is saying, how do you get from the Big Bang to Evan and Geoffrey talking, on live stream right now? Without any miracle occurring. I mean, how would that happen? And then in that context, which is a fascinating story, by the way, there's a ton of knowledge about that, but it's been in very specialized compartments. And so what I wanted to do is kind of make it more available to the generalist reader, like, okay, how does this actually work? Still kind of nerdy, frankly. If you're not nerdy, you probably wouldn't want to read it as much as I enjoyed writing it. But then the final question was, well, we've always derived our ethics from religion, right? So that, God wants you to act this way. Okay, you better act that way. Well, if you're doing a secular story, where does ethics come into this, and how do you validate and authorize ethics? That was a very important question for me. That was the last third of the book. But again, it was not a business book; it was a life book.
Wonderful. Well, life is good. I'm glad to see you're doing well. Give us a little peek at your personal life. What do you do for fun, to relax, to disconnect, to unwind?
Yeah. I mean, so Maria and I have been married for 54 years. So
50, congratulations!
It's quite a lot. But I think I'm learning. I think I'm getting better at this. As in the last few years, I like to play a lot of golf, as much as I can, and so that's a big thing for us. And we like to travel. We actually like to dine out. It's kind of one of our favorite things.
Oh,
Maria's a fabulous cook, and so which is, I think it's amazing that I don't weigh 400 pounds. I just want to be clear. So we're doing that, and then of course we have 3 children and 2 grandchildren, and the grandchildren thing is everything that everybody says it is. And
that's
so
great.
They kind of own you, and so that's always really good as well.
Well, it's wonderful. Well, it's great to see you so well, and I hope this opens a few eyes to catching up on your body of work. There's just so many great books and blogs and articles and YouTube videos. You can go and search that. But thanks so much, Jeff, for joining us and sharing.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on your show, and I hope the folks got some value out of it. It's great to talk with you.
I think we all did. Thanks so much, Jeff. Take care.